From our studios this week in Los Angeles and Tampa, this is Green Tagged Theme Park in 30, where we take the top theme park news from each week and examine why it matters to you from a professional standpoint. This week, we're going to talk a little bit about travel sentiment coming into the U.S., who might be winning, who might be losing, and where there's opportunities and maybe what you can do about it. I hope.
Yeah, if anyone has any clues, we're open to those. Yeah, if we've got some solutions, that would be great.
The big headline that we're going to start off here is that inbound travel to the U.S. was projected to be increasing by 9% this year, but instead, it's actually going to decline by at least 5%, and things are just getting worse. So we're not sure where it's going to end up, but right now, this is where we are from the latest data that came out. This data came out a few weeks ago, so you can see it's a little bit of a trailing indicator, and it's highlighting an even greater downside risk to the U.S. travel sector should trade disputes and other policy changes intensify. The latest findings reveal that an expanded trade war scenario could result in sharper declines in travel demand and economic output than previously projected. So this is like they're adjusting their projections to say that it's like getting worse. That's why I mentioned that at the top of the show. So they say here that as global trade policies remain in flux, industry stakeholders must recognize the critical link between economic policy and travel demand. Our findings warn of high-risk consequences for the U.S. travel sector with broad economic implications beyond tourism. Collaboration will be essential in navigating negative impacts, which is why we are talking about it, because we're gonna talk about collaborating and find maybe a solution, or we're just gonna, I don't know, sit here and stare at each other. I got
That's very possible. Anything is very possible. Well, I mean, the fact that, for the first time that I can remember, other than 9/11, as I think back.
Oh yeah, that was a blip. Yeah, that was a blip. That was a negative travel blip. Yeah,
that was a very negative travel blip.
And there's the pandemic.
And COVID was one, but this one doesn't. This one has to do with U.S. policy more than anything, and I think that's what is disturbing. This is something that, a terrorist attack and a global pandemic are a little bit out of our control. We would like to think, however, that policy is within our control, and it's one of those situations where when multiple countries are issuing recommendations that are. I'm going to try to be as fair with these as possible. Multiple countries are issuing recommendations that travel to the U.S. is either will have additional challenges or restrictions, or they're advising against it. So, and there's a range there depending on which country we're talking about. But it's not just the countries you might think of. Everyone's going to say, well, it's Canada and Mexico because of the trade issues, which
it's
it
also
is.
Like Brazil. I mean, it's also part of some European countries.
France, Germany. I just looked it up, and they're not saying don't go. What they're saying is, my favorite one was basically the French statement that I read, which says check with the American embassy in France prior to your departure to see if there have been any last minute changes in policy or restrictions in travel to the country, because we've seen it here. Things are changing quickly, whether we agree with them or not. They are changing quickly, and so even France is saying, if you're going to travel, make sure you know what's going on before you get on the plane, because it may change from the time you take off to the time you touch down.
Yeah, and I mean the real other context for this is like you're saying, travel to it. Like airline bookings from Canada to the U.S. are down 70% compared to the same time last year. Mm-hmm. And this is a quote from Forbes here to kind of encapsulate it, but it says, President Trump's tariffs, imperialistic rhetoric, and viral headlines of foreigners with legal tourist visas and green cards being detained by U.S. immigration officials are stacking up as significant hurdles for the U.S. travel industry and setting international travel back several years. So that's exactly what you're saying. It's like, it's not just that the countries are advising against it, but then you have also the trailing indicator of the flight decrease here. It's like we're starting to see flights being canceled, or just the demand for them decrease. And then you see, the headlines then are being like broadcast in the other countries. So it's like, it's like this echoing effect, basically.
And here's the thing that concerns me is, there are going to be people out there who are going to say, who believe that this is not valid information or this is somehow fake news. There are also going to be people out there who are going to say, "See, I told you so." The truth is, it doesn't matter.
It
It's
doesn't matter.
impacting travel. It's impacting travel anyway because it's out there, and it's the same. Philip and I both travel internationally for work, and it's the same thing that we look at. Everybody thinks that when I go to the Middle East, I'm very cavalier about it. No, I look through all of the warnings and the challenges and the things that I need to make sure I'm prepped for before I go. I am registered so that I get updates on any sort of challenges in being a United States citizen in another country. And now things are happening in reverse. They're happening when people from other countries are visiting the United States. And, the concept of being detained simply because you are visiting from another country, even if you have done everything legal up to that point, the rumors are out there. I'm going to call them rumors for now because I personally do not have substantiated documentation. I am sure it's there. But the rumors and the stories of people being detained who have all of the proper documentation, who have, gone through all of the right processes to be here in the States, and the rumors of them being abducted and detained without due process is terrifying for tourism. It's terrifying. And whether it's true or not does not matter. The fact that this perception is out there is detrimental to international travel coming into the United States, which is bringing international dollars into the U.S., certainly through the industry that we are most connected to here, which is the tourism and leisure industry. So we've got to find ways to make people feel safe. It goes back to what we've talked about over and over again, and that's creature comfort. We have to make sure that we as an industry, we as an individual organization, make people feel safe to come here. That's to me, that's the big challenge. To me, that is the overarching problem. I wish I had an answer.
Yep. I think that's going to be part of our discussion is we're not really going to have an answer, but maybe discussing other components of it, because it isn't just going to be the travel coming from inbound too. We're also seeing the consumer confidence index dip. And so basically the current reports are total US travel spending, including both domestic and inbound, is going to have a $72 billion reduction. But I think that...
Say that number again, Philip.
$72 billion reduction in total travel expenditures for this year.
Ouch. So if you are an organization or a company or a vendor that relies on your product being sold because people come to see it, that's going to slow things down. That's going to slow things. It's funny because I've had, for the first time in the 10 years of my company, this past year, or the past actually 3 or 4 months have been, it's been much more difficult to get projects off the ground. Mm-hmm. Projects that we thought were buttoned up and ready to go, people are now going, well, let's hang on for just a second and see what's going to happen here. And I'm wondering if it's because of this kind of uncertainty that they've been hesitant and holding back. And those are projects in the U.S. Projects outside the U.S. seem to be continuing forward without a hitch. So
yeah. That's what I was thinking. I was actually thinking, when we're looking at this, it's like we could flip it and say, okay, this is all bad. But if you just do a thought exercise and invert it, and ask, who could this be good for? And I think it could be good for other countries, especially countries that can embrace a friendlier, if I could see other countries even making campaigns to say, we're a friendly destination, or we want you to come to our country, and they could revamp. So this is creating an opportunity, I think, in the market for other countries. And then for us in the tourism industry, it could be an opportunity to look at doing partnerships with those. It could be working in other countries like Scott does a lot as a consultant, but also IP licensing.
The other countries have already started doing this. They're working in the Middle East. These are countries that had a PR problem as far as tourism goes. So they started working with IPs or partnering with SeaWorld, Warner Brothers, Six Flags. They started partnering with all of these recognizable brands so that they could, be less scary, quite honestly. And again, I'm not saying that they are scary places. I'm saying that there is a perception there. And
they had a branding problem, and
they
then
had
they're
a
trying to
branding
correct the
problem.
branding problem.
And this could benefit them, quite honestly. I mean, this kind of branding, because I think we're now having a branding problem.
Yeah, the U.S. now has a
The
branding
U.S.
problem.
now has a branding problem, and I think that if indeed this, who is it good for? It could be very good for, like, Saudi, for example, with Project 2030, where they're, investing so much money, so very, very much money into their tourism and leisure industry. If people aren't willing to travel to the U.S. because it's, if you're in Europe, you can go one direction or the other, and if you can, now, I'm curious to see, because a lot of the things, a lot of the reasons that countries are giving not to come to the United States are, well, specifically, I mean, let's just call it out. Specifically because the United States requires you to identify as either male or female. Now, Saudi Arabia is the same way. So, are they going to say, well, wait a minute, if financially we can bring this form of tour, or this group of tourists into our, will we loosen up? I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, we don't know, but but I think these are all opportunities, and they're things people can look at. If again, it's all branding. If you think of countries almost as if you're trying to create a competitive advantage and looking at a SWOT analysis, you're looking at the U.S. and you're like, oh, they're going into a weaker branding position, and we used to be the biggest destination, wanted destination, one of the biggest in the world for top three, in where most people come to the U.S. And so if we're going to be giving up that position, then that creates an opportunity for someone to fill it. And like you said, they could look at their policies and say, maybe we can adjust this. If we do this, could we get this in? Maybe Japan also, they've been working on, we talked about the Japanese tourist program previously. Maybe they can also expand that program and capture more interest from people that are not the US, and kind of get from, like you said, other countries nearby, right?
Well, and I'm wondering if this is just going to benefit, because we've had a lot of discussion about some of the recognizable park brands opening up in the UK, opening up in, is if you can go to a Universal property without visiting the United States, is that going to benefit Universal UK, or if you can go to, well, Puy du Fou is French. So yeah, there's that. But if you don't have to travel, to me, this seems like it's going to be a big boon for the local attractions, and especially those outside of the United States. I think that's who's really going to benefit from this downturn.
Well, we talked about it a little bit when we talked about last week, when we talked about the Herschend, acquisition and the sale. And it's like, it's funny because you look at this data, because by the time that we get it, or by the time it comes here, it's, like I said, it's trailing. So you've got to know that people had this information earlier. Like I mentioned, when I was at the TEA event, the hotel operators there already knew, because they can see in real time, right? So they've known for months that the travel is decreasing. But it's like, these are all trailing indicators. But so you've got to know that Disney has economists on staff, and that that Universal has, and so you got to think that they've probably forecasted and they've laid out scenarios like this. So it's almost like we're piecing together their strategy now and looking at, whether looking at it, and you can see, oh, well, yeah, that going into this area, if the US continues to lose this position and Europe becomes better positioned, especially the London area, then, putting this something within the London driving region, and it being a US brand, but not having to go to the US. I mean, you could see about a strong argument, considering the new data we got, which they probably had at the time they were doing their master planning.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and again, I think back to 9/11. One of the things, because I was working with Bush Tampa during the 9/11 situation. And one of the things that saved the Busch Gardens Tampa Park is we were at about a 50-50. We are about 50% tourism, importing tourism, and about 50% local. And it was when tourism, both internal and international, shut down basically after 9/11, the park still was able to keep its head above water because we had such a strong local draw. I'm curious to see now. Orlando was hit hard during that, and I'm wondering if this is going to be the same situation here. The companies in Orlando may not. I mean, the companies that have parks in Orlando may not, because they, as you say, were smart enough to start investing outside of, not putting all of our eggs in one basket kind of thing.
No, that's an excellent point. I was thinking of that too, because you're thinking about how, again, as with everything, it's going to impact people differently based off their business model. So Disneyland, I'm not sure this matters to Disneyland because,
Correct.
there's so many locals that it's like the parks are still too busy.
There are people who move to California because of Disneyland. I mean, let's be honest. They're that
like
dedicated a fan base.
Yes.
Yeah, like you. Yes. Exactly right.
But then you have other sectors, like when we've talked about all of this when we talked about, Universal going into Vegas and how the percentage of Vegas relies on international tourism. And then, much more like Vegas, it will be more impacted than Los Angeles because Los Angeles relies less on that whole part as a percentage of their operating. And then Orlando, we've talked about this for years. It's no secret. Orlando really relies on being an international hub for folks. And I mean, this is a whole supply chain problem, right? If flights are being canceled, that means the airlines are going to reduce flights, which means that it's going to have a multi-year impact on the industry because if people can't get there, they can't go to it. So you need the flights to remain intact. And in order for the flights to remain intact, they need a certain level of demand. I mean, it's a whole chain.
And then it goes into hotel rooms because, if there is a decline, then hotel rooms diminish. So that if there is going to be a resurgence again, depending on how long the decline goes, if there's going to be a resurgence again, many of those hotels will have closed their doors and, we'll have to rebuild that part of the industry as well. The ones I really feel sorry for are and I don't want to call them mom and pops, but when you go, like if you're in Orlando and you drive down iDrive, there's a lot of independent businesses that rely on the tourism that the theme parks bring. And those are the ones that I think are really going to be hurting because nobody local in Florida stops at the Disney, Diznee gift store. They're going to go to the parks or they're going to go to Disney Springs or whatever. But it's those, and the things like coffee shops, things like, restaurants, things like the smaller tourist bases, the helicopter flights. Orlando has you can fly around Orlando in a helicopter, but nobody's going to come to Orlando to fly in a helicopter.
Yes,
they're going to come for Disney and then fly, or come for Universal and then fly in a helicopter.
That's all going to be inbound international travel because those people want to experience those. It's not going to be people who live there. But it's interesting. So on the 20th, so a little bit, 10 days ago, as we're recording this, Disney World had their shareholder meeting, and we're not going to get into that. I didn't have time to notate every single thing and fact check everything that was said in that. So another time, kids, another time. But they didn't get to that this week.
Though. They did make some pretty cool announcements.
Yeah, so they did make some big announcements. That's what we're going to talk about. I'll give you just the basic sentiment of the call, which is that, remember last year there was this kind of struggling about, activist inventors. This one was pretty much no one said anything and they just were trying to just go straight through. But basically what Iger did is reiterate his investment in the parks, and which is interesting now when we think about it in the context of what we're talking about. It's all this uncertainty, the instability or whatnot, then it makes sense as a brand that he's hey, the parks are strong, the parks aren't going away, you should come visit the parks because the parks are great. And in line with that, a few days later, which is this week on the 26th, they did announce a bunch of stuff specifically for Disney World. A lot of this was announcements that they already had made, but they gave us dates and then a few new things. So The quick list is that there's a refurb coming to Buzz Lightyear. The Villains show and the Little Mermaid show are going to open on May 27th. They did confirm that the new nighttime parade is going to debut later this summer. No date, but they're just like, hey, it's still happening. It's gonna happen later. They're also bringing Goofy to the Communicore Hall to do interactive elements there, and then Test Track is going to be reopening also later in summer. So a lot of live entertainment, and I'm wondering here, is this a play for locals or is this a play for internationals? Because I don't think internationals are going to care about a Villain show and Little Mermaid and Test Track and all this blah blah. But maybe, I don't know.
Well, so Little Mermaid. Let's look at Little Mermaid just as in a microcosm for just a hot second. Little Mermaid was one of the most popular shows, and it's been closed for quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
This has been closed. If I'm not mistaken, this was a COVID close that never came back.
Interesting.
So
yeah, I remember it from when I worked there, but you're right.
This is a brand new show. This is a brand new show. So
it's like they're just barely now getting back to like 2019.
Well, I think what's happened. So I think this to kind of directly answer your question. I think that this one may play to the locals because it was a favorite. It was a favorite. Everybody loved it. And people have been grousing about the fact that it's been gone for so long. The Villain show. I think this is something that they've been teasing about. This has been everything from a villain's park to a villain's land. Now we're down to a villain show, but still Disney villains are so hot and so popular. And so I think this is something that is going to Disneylandify Walt Disney World a little bit to bring in some of the locals. I think the live entertainment brings in the locals. I really do. I think the reopening of Test Track is focused on the internationals. But I think all of these, I think the refocus on the parks is exactly what we were saying. This is telling people it is worth the hassle to come here because our parks are better than ever.
Yep. And then you add to that the context too of like Epic is going to be opening on the 20th and they just announced the stuff for the 27th. So it's almost like a week. And I mean, that's so it's like, I think it's almost like you could make the case if you were traveling here from Brazil or traveling here from the UK, you're like, oh, if we come in June, then we can do all of these things because we can do Epic and we could go see all these new shows. We could do all these new rides.
Disney and Universal do not operate in a vacuum. They know exactly what the other well, more than we think. Let me put it that way. They know more than we think about what and when things are going to open. And
because they all know each other and they've worked for both companies, gone back and forth.
Everybody knows each other. You've got people, they're not vast majority, but there's a huge contingent of frontline people and even middle management that work in both parks.
Yeah.
And then have a part-time gig at SeaWorld. So, they know what's going on. It's not hidden. It's only just not announced. That's what it really boils down to. So you're absolutely right, Philip. This is one of those situations where they're going, well, we can go in June and we can, instead of spending 1 week, we'll spend 2 weeks and we'll see all these new things at Magic Kingdom and Walt Disney World. And we'll see all these and we'll see Epic and we'll see, you're absolutely right. This is a power play. Because again, they had this international, they were prognosticating this international downturn in tourism as well. And they're doing everything they can. So this may be one of the things, I mentioned earlier, can we find a solution? This may be one of those solutions. And that is make it so that it's worth the quote unquote hassle to come to the US because we've got so much to do that makes it worthwhile.
I'm not sure that IAAPA was referring exactly to this, but like you just said, this is basically what they meant. What wasn't IAAPA? Sorry, it was the global tourism report when they said that like collaboration within the industry is going to be essential. And I mean, I think they mean all dimensions of collaboration. So they mean problem solving, but they also mean this. Like effectively, they'll never admit this on their share calls because they can't. But I'm sure that Disney Universal, the people are sitting there together and they're saying, how can we work together to make this something where you have to come this summer because of all this happening? We're opening our new park and you open these things. We're going to do it kind of in the same window, but not at the same weekend because we still need the news. We don't want to compete for news. So we're going to give you this week and we're going to get this week. But they're definitely coordinating this, I think. And
that happens all the time. I know that for a fact. I've experienced that firsthand, that especially from an opening standpoint and a media standpoint. There are specific times where the parks will all get together and say, okay, like for example, seasonal events that all have to open in roughly the same window. They will say, okay, we're going to do our Halloween media night on this night, and you're going to do yours here, and you're going to do. They never want to compete. They never want to compete for media. That's stupid. It doesn't benefit anybody.
So I think this is exactly it, because effectively then you can get media covering Epic on the first weekend, and then you can get media covering Disney World, and then now all of the vacation planners and all that whole legion of people who work to sell trips can now go to everybody and say, oh, here's new news. And now it's even more reason for you to finalize that trip that you've been looking at to come to the US and do this summer. And I think this is the collaboration that they meant earlier.
I agree.
And I wonder if other regions are going to need to do this at all, or really it's going to just depend, I guess, on how much the local industry is impacted by international traffic.
Right. And some other markets are really good at collaboration because they're all owned by the same company. And other markets will have to reach out and shake hands across the aisle a little bit. But this is all great. This is all well and good for a short term. Here's what we're going to do in the summer. But my question is, and I think you raised it in our show notes, so I guess it's your question really, is how long is this going to take? I mean, how long is this going to last? Is this going to impact things like the Olympics? Is this going to impact, things that are a little further down the road? And I don't think we have enough information yet. As you say, we're kind of getting this data on the back end as opposed to on the front end. And I'm wondering if, we have enough to recognize whether it's going to, by 2028, is this still going to be a problem?
I actually am going to go with that it is going to be a problem almost no matter what, because I think that the damage is basically done. I think unless there is an enormous political change in the U.S. Before the 4-year window, or even I think basically people that are waiting on the midterms, I don't think that's not going to happen early enough, because the damage will have been done by the time we get there, because we just talked about how this is a multi-year cycle. And so if we think back, so to bring it to me, to give just a real example here of something I just recently had to deal with, is I was trying to figure out my trip to China to go to IAAPA Asia. And that's when I discovered just recently, when I was trying to find this travel, that the amount of flights that we had in 2019 have still not recovered. I mean, we don't have hardly any that can get me to where I need to get, which means it's so much more expensive to get there. I'll have to go to DFW or go to a different hub to get a plane to go where I want, or take connections in Europe. I mean, it's crazy. And it's like, that is the problem. And when you see all this negative sentiment, and then the supply chains that provide the people, or that provide the infrastructure to flying into LAX, when those start to diminish, then they're just not going to come back. And you're not going to be able to correct in time for something like the Olympics. And it's also just a sentiment, you can't, they talk about that trust is a bank, and you put into it and then you take out, right?
Right.
But the withdrawal is always harder, right? It's like you have to do 3 or 4, payments in deposits to get one withdrawal, because that's how humans work. Right. And all we've been doing recently is just damaging our reputation. I think it's going to be harder than people think to turn that around. So I just think there's a lot of people that are just going to protest or not want to feel like they want to even come here. We're not going to be able to turn that around, in enough time to get that demand for 2028. It's just not going to happen. That's my take.
I hope that from again, in the microcosm of tourism, I'm not talking about the economy as a whole, because I don't understand it well enough to really speak intelligently, but from the economy of tourism, I hope that we can continue to find ways to make it worth the effort to come to the United States. I hope we can continue to find ways, because this is money that's just coming into the U.S. This is not making taxpayers pay for anything more. This is not helping internal companies increase their profit margins, or this is bringing money in from outside the country, which benefits us as Americans. When the money comes in from outside, it benefits us. And if we break that, I think you're right. We're going to have a challenge. But I think the thing that we have to put out there, so that everybody, just to kind of bring this back full circle, cooperation, handshaking, finding ways to make those people who are visiting from other countries, or even other parts of the country, of other parts of the United States, if we can collaborate and work together, I think that is a way to at least. We're still going to be competing for people's time and money. I get that. I understand that. But it is better to get them traveling to your town. That increases the chance that they will come and see you exponentially. And if you can work with your Convention of Visitors bureaus, if you can work with each other directly, I think that is going to be the first step in hopefully solving this problem. I wish we could solve this problem completely, but unfortunately, we are out of time. So, and maybe I don't know what we're going to do in Unhinged, because we never know what we're going to do in Unhinged. But for those of you who are not part of our Patreon show Unhinged, this is your information for the week. I hope you enjoyed this little discussion. We will see all of you next week. So until next time, on behalf of Philip Hernandez and myself, Scott Swenson, this is Green Tagged Theme Park in 30, and we will see you next week.
Yeah, if you felt that we added value and that it was enough value to visit us on our Patreon, go to our Patreon. Go just type in Green Tagged in Patreon.
He will never let me do a clean exit. He will never let me do a clean exit. It always has to be he has to get the last word. He's such a control freak.